If I told you that I suffer with a learning difficulty, what would your immediate impression of me be? How would your idea of me be altered? How about if I told you that it was dyspraxia? I can guarantee that 90% of you haven't ever heard of it, or most think of it as just something that makes someone more clumsy or something, but that's not the case. It wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration to say that dyspraxia has ruined my life, and I'm about to explain how. Take a step back and have an objective look at your life. Think about everything that you do in your life, from work to interpersonal relationships to, sports, video games, whatever. Think about your childhood, everything that involved, everything you succeeded and struggled with. Okay, so now you have an idea of what your life both is and has been up to this point. I hope you have a few fond or happy memories mixed up in there. Now I want you to imagine that everything you do, every skill you have, everything you take for granted, everything you've achieved, do not exactly disappear but be dampened. Difficult. I want you to imagine that everything you do is so much harder. Like, if your life right now can be compared to a brisk walk, imagine that instead you're wading through a pool of waist-deep honey. It's still possible to get to your destination, and you might even do it more carefully and conscientiously, but it takes a huge amount of effort, exhausts you, and causes you to become angry and frustrated that you're the only one who has to wade through the honey. Everyone else just gets to walk through with minimal effort, go about their everyday lives without issue, not have to worry about how they get around, or adjusting their life in any way to compensate for the honey, or had any opportunities taken away from them because they have to spend all of their time and effort dealing with the fact that their entire life is a constant struggle due to the fact that they're wading through honey. That is what living with dyspraxia is like. I'm still smart, I'm still creative, I'm still compassionate, driven, passionate, all that stuff. And I like to think that I have a lot of the same positive attributes our society claims to value. In fact, if we lived under a fairer economic system, I'd probably be doing okay. But we don't. I'm expected to perform at the same level as others, to hit the same targets, to match others' prowess in the workplace and elsewhere in society, despite the fact that in order to do so, I've had to wade through honey whilst they just get to walk on over to the boss's office to ask for that promotion. It's impossible to keep up at the same kind of level as your co-workers. To keep pace is a Herculean task, and getting ahead is unthinkable. So at some point you have to just sort of accept your relative inability to compete and kind of inhabit the space marked liability, incompetent, lazy, etc. But just to reiterate, dyspraxics aren't incompetent, we just have different skills and abilities that aren't really valued by our society, or if they are, finding work in those areas is either pointless or incredibly difficult. Like, by and large, apparently, we have a higher propensity for empathy, but what job can you get with that? Carer? Okay, that's a pretty horrible job that pays basically nothing but requires serious dedication that not everyone can muster. Nurse? Again, arguably a hard, demanding job that pays more, but there are still nurses relying on food banks to survive, and on top of all that, you have to go through highly specialised training and education in order to be qualified for it. We're also unusually creative, but there's not that many creative jobs out there, and trust me, I've spent years looking, and I have a degree in writing. Clearly, playing to our strengths is not feasible for everyone with the condition, so what are the alternatives? Go into quote-unquote normal work. If my experience is anything to go by, that's easier said than done. As mentioned above, we dyspraxics are forced to operate at a level of competence that we are frankly unable to achieve or maintain because the things we struggle with, spatial awareness, attention to detail, ability to process things quickly, are things that 99% of jobs require at least a base level of ability to carry out. Take me, for example. I made that video recently about call centres, and that's been most of my work life for the past few years, so let's use that as a case study. I can't multitask really, I struggle to process information accurately, I forget to read key pieces of information to customers, and I usually end up on some kind of PIP or performance improvement plan. It's at this point that I'm forced to produce this document, which is an assessment carried out a few years ago outlining the various issues I suffer at work and ways in which my workstation can be adjusted to suit my disability. This can go one of a few ways. Usually the company will read through the document, realise that many of the suggestions contained within it would cost them money, and ignore it or pretend not to have seen it, forcing me to then threaten to sue them under the Equalities Act unless they do something, at which point they then drag their feet to do the bare minimum to support me at work, whilst actively trying to find ways to fire me without it being obvious that that's what they're doing. And of course I can't just tell them in an interview because, hey, I'm going to be objectively worse at this job than almost every other applicant, and also in order for me to operate at even a base level of competence, you will have to make significant monetary and practical sacrifices. It's not a method destined to land you any job, but that's just one sector. Of course, it would be reasonable for you to respond by saying, well, you just picked jobs that weren't suited to you. So allow me to go through a couple of other jobs I've had. During university, I worked part-time at a sandwich shop making sandwiches for drunk people on the night shift. My lack of fine motor skills and inability to do fiddly things like laying out meat on a sandwich or distributing vegetables at speed meant that I would usually be the one holding the queue up as I tried to unstick slices of ham or something. After I graduated, I was promoted to store supervisor, which sounds fancy, but basically all it meant was that I was alone in the store, illegally because the franchisee didn't want to pay anyone else's wages, from about 6 AM making all the bread, cutting up the vegetables, etc., while serving the occasional person who'd reached a point in their life where Subway breakfast sounded like a good idea, and giving free cups of tea to homeless people who came in, which the store owner hated, but not enough for it to be worth his while getting up early enough to stop me. Again, multitasking, which I struggle with, fine motor skills, and trying to do fiddly complex things at speed. Or how about the time I worked in a kitchen? Well, I really struggled to keep up with orders, often lost track of the instructions I was supposed to be following, and as a result was put permanently on pot wash. Or there's the time I worked in admin for an investment bank, processing invoices, about half of which I got little details wrong on. The world of work is not a place for people like me most of the time. I can do my best to try to compete and put in more effort than almost everyone else, but that means that I can never have an off day. I completely exhaust myself to the point of having to pass out when I get home, and I still have to deal with a lot of unavoidable issues. Even when I operate at 200% the ordinary capacity of most people, I'm still at best a thoroughly mediocre worker, and it makes me fucking miserable and exhausted. I regularly get depressed about this, feeling worthless and like I don't fit, like I'm not meant for this world. On one of these occasions, I searched out and found a Facebook group designed as a support group of sorts for people like me, because I didn't know anyone like me and I wanted to know if this was just me or dyspraxic thing, and I learned two things that day. One, that it was indeed a dyspraxic thing, and two, that there was no real solution. I actually posted on there outlining everything I've just said here, and I got quite a few comments saying that they completely empathise with me, but the overwhelming majority of proposed solutions or success stories posted by people who managed to overcome their disability and get by essentially boiled down to just become self-employed. Literally that simple. Just become self-employed. Oh, okay then, cheers, because that's so fucking easy to do, right? Jesus fucking Christ. So how about applying for some kind of disability benefit? If you're unable to work, or at least unable to hold down a job due to your disability, then surely that might qualify you for some kind of assistance. Nope, I have no idea if it ever was, but right now the government is clamping down so hard on people claiming disability benefits that you basically just have to Google DWP disability and scroll down a bit to see the frankly terrifying lengths they're willing to go to in order to strip often very obviously legitimately disabled people of their benefits. And if this guy is fit for work, then I doubt I have much of a chance. It's one of the most frustrating things about having dyspraxia. It seriously affects my life in many ways that much more serious or obvious disabilities do, but no one really wants to acknowledge that, and it's so frustrating being stuck in this limbo, not being recognisably disabled enough, if you want to use that kind of measurement, to get any real help, but too disabled to be able to live an ordinary life without help. It should be no surprise to you that growing up being objectively just a little bit worse than your peers at most things our society deems important can have a huge impact on your mental health, and especially your relationships. I, for example, suffer from sex addiction, as I mentioned in a previous video, in no small part because, not to toot my own horn too much, I actually know that sex is something I'm reasonably good at, and from which I get positive feedback. Seriously, I'm not actually anything spectacular, but apparently most men don't perform cunnilingus, so if you want to be seen as a sex god man, it's literally as simple as enthusiastically going down on your partner, which after a lifetime of being rejected, beaten down, mocked and belittled for being subpar at almost everything I tried my hand at, was a huge fucking deal. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it really was, and still is, that important to me. Here was incontrovertible proof that I'm not only good at something, but the feedback I got was instant, gratifying, and instantly addictive to me. Now, the rest of this video could easily be taken up by simply saying, watch the sex addiction video, because honestly my disability actively created my obsession, which in turn caused all the stuff I mentioned there, so I'll leave it here for now, with an addendum that severe anxiety and an inferiority complex caused by such a disability affects relationships in so many ways, though I have made progress in overcoming some of these issues. It's difficult sometimes to force myself to keep going, to keep trying, to keep fighting, when I know that the chances of failure are as close to 100% as possible without actually being 100%, and it's been the reason for most of my darkest moments, in combination with my mental health and addiction issues. Every time I've had to leave a job, every time I've lost an appeal, every time I've suffered as a result of circumstances out of my control, the temptation to just stop trying, to wallow, to stagnate, to simply accept that I don't deserve to exist is so strong, so powerful that it scares me. It's not an exaggeration to say that if I lived in a country where guns were legal, I would have put a bullet in my head a good few times by now. Just off the top of my head, when I worked at a bank branch in which the manager was abusive, had no sympathy for my plight, and attempted to have me fired for making her look bad due to mistakes I made thanks to my disability, she was unsuccessful. successful, but I was then forced to raise a grievance against her, which was also dismissed by the company, and then I was faced with having to work with her every day again, so I quit. I stood at the bus stop home after she blindsided me by trying to get me fired, and seriously thought about walking out into traffic. Or maybe the time when I was in university, the pressure of studying and assignments and the prospects of failing again got to me, and I reached the point where I actually bought razor blades and was fully prepared to just end it all right then. Most recently, after one more example of this cycle, when my most recent employer was faced with having to spend time and money making adjustments to my workspace in order to accommodate me, I predictably found myself being dragged into meeting after meeting, attempting to bully me out, until I finally found myself being accused of something I hadn't done, and for which misunderstanding I had perfectly reasonable explanations, and I realised that I was facing a situation from which there is no escape. This is it now. I have to either jump from job to job every year or so, or try to last and end up going through periods of unemployment as a result. So, here I am. A square peg in the round hole of our society, destined to suffer as a result of being someone for whom the world was not designed, but not so obviously that I actually qualify for any help or support, so I'm just like you, except worse in every area in very subtle ways. And don't get me wrong, I'm not really saying that I have it as badly as someone like this, but merely that it sucks and is incredibly frustrating to be stuck in this in-between space where I'm expected to conform to societal norms and standards as if I'm not disabled, but I'm not so obviously disabled as to actually get a little bit of leniency, understanding, or basic fucking empathy. So I'm destined to just fail sideways until I either get incredibly lucky or die. What fun.
Cause he was going out of town. I asked him where and he said New Mexico. I asked if I could get a ride. He said no, you don't want to follow me. Where is I'm going? He backed out of the driveway. It was the last time we saw him. Cause he drove straight to his parents' cabin and put a bullet in his head. Your heart is a muscle the size of your fist. Keep on loving, keep on fighting, and hold on, and hold on. Hold on for your life, for your life.
Hello, so that was, as you can probably guess, the third in the three Passion Project videos that I've been working on. The other two being, of course, the Death Inventor video, which no one watched, but that's fine, I mostly made it for me, and the Sex Diction video. So this is the last one of these that you'll see, probably. Thanks for watching. You didn't really have to. I mainly just made this for my own peace of mind, but I hope you enjoyed it if you did, and your regularly scheduled programming will continue shortly.